Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Tuesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, crazy, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. All of it brought to you by ZipRecruiter. Right now, Three Martini Lunch listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free. Just head to ZipRecruiter.com/martini. ZipRecruiter.com/martini. Much more on that a little bit later in the podcast. And Jim, we start with our good martini, which might come as a bit of a surprise to some because it's Claire McCaskill making her case to Missouri voters. But I think Claire McCaskill's strategy has changed. Whatever you think of Claire McCaskill, most of her voting doesn't seem to suggest that she's trying to fool anyone in the months leading up to her reelection effort in a fairly red state. She voted against Kavanaugh. She voted against pretty much every big-ticket item, Obamacare repeal, the tax cuts. Apparently, she sides with Trump 45% of the time. And so when Bret Baier asked her about the fact that she voted against Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, she mentioned that she supported 70% of Trump's overall judicial nominations, which led to Bret Baier asking her about a specific ad she has that tries to separate her from other Democrats. Take a listen to this.
I voted for more than half of his cabinet members. I vote with him half the time. He signed 38 of my bills into law. That doesn't sound like, to me, somebody who is knee-jerk. Some of my colleagues are knee-jerk against the president. I don't get up every day figuring out how to fight the president. I get up every day trying to figure out how I can fight for Missourians.
To that point, you have this radio ad out now that says, at one point in an exchange, she's not one of these crazy Democrats.
Claire's not afraid to stand up against her own party.
Yep, and Claire's not one of those crazy Democrats.
Who's the crazy Democrat?
The crazy Democrats are people who walk in restaurants and scream in elected officials' faces. The crazy Democrats we have a state senator here in Missouri that actually advocated for the assassination of President Trump. That's a crazy Democrat.
And then a great follow-up from Bret Baier here with a fascinating answer.
Well, just to be clear, there's not another crazy Democrat in the Senate.
Well, I would say this. I would not call my colleagues crazy, but Elizabeth Warren sure went after me when I advocated tooling back some of the regulations for small banks and credit unions. I certainly disagree with Bernie Sanders on a bunch of stuff.
Jim, we talked about it last week when the media had no idea who was behind the mail bombings at that point. You always love sentences that start with, I would never say that about anyone, but... And so Claire McCaskill has basically decided to throw the progressive wing of her party under the bus in hopes that she'll fool some people in Missouri.
Greg, I would never call any of my colleagues crazy. You know, Elizabeth Lay, Oren Way, Booker K, Ori K. Here I am, I'm flunking Pig Latin, which is kind of par for my foreign language skills. But yeah, it's really kind of amusing to watch a Democrat suddenly, 2 weeks before the election, I'm not trying to fight President Trump. Whoa, this is kind of interesting. The interesting thing is I would have guessed that considering the dynamics of the state in like North Dakota, that Heidi Heitkamp would be playing this role and trying to say, look, I'm nothing like all those other Democrats. She chose to vote against Kavanaugh, and it's been all downhill ever since, including that god-awful ad revealing the names of sexual abuse victims, and some of the women had not been the victims of sexual abuse and things like that. That was really, really bad. And I figured McCaskill probably would have been proud to go down with the ship and say, look forward to post-senatorial life. The ground shifted underneath her feet. The state became redder and redder. She lucked out going up against Todd Aiken last time around. She just didn't have that and was running in a presidential year. And that she would do it. This is kind of shameful and transparent. And I'm just going to observe, here's the really interesting thing here is, one, Kavanaugh got confirmed with Manchin's vote. And I think, most people say that I still hear Republicans saying, don't count out Patrick Morrissey. This race is getting closer, all that kind of stuff. Look, Joe Manchin voting for Kavanaugh. Every Republican was celebrating except the folks of the Patrick Morrissey campaign because that made their life a heck of a lot harder to make the argument you can't vote with Joe Manchin. Although I did kind of like Vice President Mike Pence going to West Virginia at a rally for Morrissey and saying, well, look, we learned from that. You can always count on Joe Manchin when you no longer need him. He'll be very happy to be that 52nd vote. He doesn't want to be. I guess he was the 51st vote, but Pence was going to break the tie. So, you can make that argument. Look, I kind of wonder, if Claire McCaskill had voted for Kavanaugh, would she be in a safer spot right now? Maybe Missouri Democrats would be up in arms, but, most West Virginia Democrats are falling in line. Joe Donnelly might be asking that kind of question here, but it's really kind of fascinating to see. Donnelly's ad kind of had that same line of, I'm not like those crazy Democrats, and showcasing protesters and stuff like that. So kind of interesting. Maybe you could make the argument that the nut job banging on the doors of the Supreme Court protesters actually gave these red state Democrats a fairly easy target for them to say, oh, I'm not like those people. And Joe Donnelly and Claire McCaskill are not beating on the doors of the Supreme Court. They're not going into restaurants and screaming at Ted Cruz. But Greg, that's a really low bar to clear. Yeah, I'm a centrist because I'm not assaulting people. Yeah, congratulations. You want a medal or a monument?
Claire McCaskill just doing a 180 in this campaign. And folks in Missouri, if you think this is genuine, you're not being very smart. And you know what's also not smart? Job sites that overwhelm you with tons of the wrong resumes. But you know what is smart? ZipRecruiter.com/martini.
Unlike other job sites, ZipRecruiter does not wait for the candidates to find you. ZipRecruiter finds them for you. Its powerful matching technology scans thousands of resumes, identifies people with the right skills, education, and experience for your job, and actively invites them to apply. So you get qualified candidates fast. No more sorting through piles of resumes, no more waiting for the right candidate to apply. It's no wonder that ZipRecruiter is rated #1 by employers in the United States. This rating comes from hiring sites on Trustpilot with more than 1,000 reviews.
And right now, 3 Martini Lunch listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this exclusive web address, ZipRecruiter.com/martini. That's ZipRecruiter.com/MARTINI. ZipRecruiter.com/martini. After all, ZipRecruiter is the smartest way to hire. All right, Jim, let's move to Crazy Martini number 1. And I think this is a double-barreled Crazy Martini, but let's start over at Axios, since they claim to have broken this story. President Trump plans to sign an executive order that would remove the right to citizenship for babies of non-citizens and unauthorized immigrants born on U.S. soil, he said yesterday in an exclusive interview for Axios on HBO. This would be the most dramatic move yet in Trump's hardline immigration campaign, this time targeting quote-unquote anchor babies and chain migration. And it would set off another standoff with the courts, as Trump's power to do this through executive action is debatable, to say the least. Trump told Axios on HBO that he has run the idea of ending birthright citizenship by his counsel and plans to proceed with the highly controversial move, which will certainly face legal challenges. Here's a clip between Axios' Jonathan Swan and President Trump.
It was always told to me that you needed a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Guess
14th
what?
Amendment.
You don't.
You don't.
Number one, you don't need that. Number two,
I mean, that's in dispute.
You could definitely
that's very much in dispute.
Well, you can definitely do it with an act of Congress, but now they're saying I can do it just with an executive order. Now, how ridiculous! We're the only country in the world where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, and it has to end.
Okay, here's Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which is obviously where this debate comes from. The 14th Amendment passed in the wake of the Civil War. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, down in Section 5, it says the Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So the idea that he can do this by executive order is absurd. I mean, we raked President Obama over the coals for DACA and also for, in late 2014, after he got crushed in the midterms, for allowing adults to stay in the country who were here illegally. So it may certainly be possible for Congress to tweak the law, but for the president to think he can do this unilaterally is absurd. And then for all the Democrats who have suddenly rediscovered how government works when they didn't complain about Obama doing it, now throwing their hands up in the air is kind of fun, too.
Yeah, look, this is crazy on multiple levels. But here's the thing. It comes from conflating 3 different questions. The first is, what should our policy be? The second is, what does the Constitution say? And the third one is, how is the Constitution interpreted if there's any vagueness in those words. Now, you did a fantastic job of laying out what the Constitution says. Now, there are a bunch of people who jump onto that phrase and say, well, wait a second. That clause there indicates that it clearly was never meant to include certain groups of people, most notably at the time Native Americans. If you're a foreign ambassador and your wife give birth to a child while you're posted here in the United States, your child is not automatically a U.S. citizen. If, God forbid, the United States territory were ever invaded and conquered by some army, because we recognize that territory as still being part of us, they have a child, no, that would not automatically become a United States citizen. Here's my argument. I feel look, we haven't changed the Constitution since 1992, when we banned members of Congress from voting themselves a pay raise. All pay raises have to take effect in the next Congress. Now, I know people don't like doing this, Greg, because it's hard. But you know what? We've managed to do it 20-some times. Let's give it a try. Let's start an effort to pass a constitutional amendment to clarify the 14th Amendment to say birthright citizenship is not meant to apply to those who are born of those who have entered the country illegally. I think you could get pretty broad support of that. Maybe you wouldn't. I'm not going to say that the anchor baby issue is not a real one. I'm not going to say, in fact, I actually believe you could argue, yes, this is taking advantage of our Constitution, taking advantage of a law and applying it in a circumstance it was never meant to apply. Fine. We can have this argument. I think the country would be well served by this argument. You've heard about the birthing clinics set up where, wealthy folks from all around the world, particularly China, come over and have their child here in the United States, and they now have a child who is a U.S. citizen, and then begin that with the process of chain migration and stuff like that. I think this is all a really good argument to have, and I think changes are completely justifiable in light of current circumstances. But you can't do it through an executive order. That's not how this works. And it's kind of fascinating to see people. A couple weeks ago, I was writing the Morning Jolt, and I said how people don't like seeing policy changed on a dime. When people have been doing things a certain way for a really long time, they do not like somebody from up on high saying, no, you've been wrong all this time. You have to change immediately. And the two examples I gave were two judges who over the years said that, including under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, violated the Constitution, that it constituted the establishment of a state religion. Now, first of all, on the face of it, I think this is absurd. But the second thing is the sense that, people have been doing this their whole lives. And if you're some judge and you say, hey, everybody in this courtroom, everybody in America, every time you said the Pledge of Allegiance, you were violating the Constitution. Of course people are going to hate you when you say that. Of course people are going to look at you like you've got two heads and you're crazy. You're not Moses. You didn't just get, from the divine, oh, hey, I have this new interpretation of the Constitution. You've been doing it wrong all this time. So there's something in the neighborhood of 160 years of precedent of what birthright citizenship meant. And there's the plain meaning, in my eyes, of the 14th Amendment. Now, I know some people dispute that clause, but my attitude is if they wanted to say this does not apply to people who enter the country illegally, they could have put that into the language. So I would say, you want to change this? Go change the Constitution. And for everybody who says, it's hard, Greg, that's the exact same argument we get from the gun control crowd. That's why they prefer to find some judge who will interpret it the way they want and just kind of hand wave it away instead of going through the process of actually trying to change the Constitution. Look, if you want to change the law on this kind of level, on this kind of fundamental definition of no longer decreeing that if you are born in the United States, you are a United States citizen, I think we need to have that big national debate that would surround the process of changing the Constitution. So that's what I think we do it. Again, the other thing is also worth noting is that Trump says he's going to do a lot of things, and they don't always come to fruition. He says White House counsel says they can do this. I'd like to see which White House counsel that is. Maybe it's Michael Anton, the former National Security Council spokesman, who's been one of the most outspoken supporters of this policy. My suspicion is, Greg, that if he took this to the Supreme Court, we know he's going to lose all four of the lefties, but I actually think that it's easy to see not just one, but maybe even all five of the other five, including Gorsuch, including Kavanaugh, would look at this and say, no, you can't change the way the 14th Amendment is interpreted by executive order. I don't think they'd spend all that much time on that, Greg, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, exactly right. I think you laid it out very well. We're not talking about the merits of what Trump wants to do. That's a vigorous debate that can and should happen. But what power the executive actually has to affect this should not be in doubt here. He can't do this unilaterally. But we're not done with crazy politicians. After all, we have an election coming up, which means they're working 7 days a week. And when you have them working and speaking publicly 7 days a week, craziness will ensue. All right, let's move on to Crazy Martini number 2 now. And Florida Senator Bill Nelson, he's in a very tight re-election fight looking for a 4th term against Republican Rick Scott, the governor of Florida. CNN, Florida Senator Bill Nelson compared the current political climate in the United States to that of the African country of Rwanda before a genocide that killed about 800,000 people in the 1990s. Nelson, a Democrat who is facing a stiff re-election challenge from Scott, made the comment Sunday while stumping at the Covenant Missionary Baptist Church in Florida City, Florida. Nelson was accompanied at the event by Democratic California Senator Kamala Harris. He said that when a place gets so tribal that the two tribes won't have anything to do with each other, and that's when we get into trouble.
Jealousy turns into hate. And we saw what happened to the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. It turned into a genocide. 1 million people hacked to death within a few months. And we have got to watch what's happening here in America.
Now, that audio wasn't great. He said that jealousy turns to hate, and we saw what happened to the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. It turned to a genocide. 1 million people hacked to death within a few months, and we've got to watch what's happening here. Jim, we've clearly talked many times about how our discourse is not good. It's quite toxic in certain circumstances. Claire McCaskill even referred to it about getting in people's faces in restaurants. We're still pretty far away from literally hacking each other to death to the tune of 800,000 people.
Yeah, when you began talking about jealousy leads to hate, Greg, I thought we were going to get a new and innovative adaptation of that wise philosopher Yoda, who said, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Suffering means you've been watching the prequels. So first of all, I periodically wonder if Bill Nelson is doing okay. It was a couple weeks ago where he adamantly insisted he had not signed a letter that he had sent back in the Obama years. And so he's getting up there in years. And to say, oh, my goodness, we're on the verge of seeing Rwanda here in the United States of America. Let's remember something. The nut job who was sending the bombs to prominent Democrats was living in a van. This was not a guy who was part of a big, effective group. He did not have a lot of followers. He was a guy who was a sad loser in life who decided, this is how I'm going to help the president who I love so much. I'm going to send a bunch of bombs that thankfully didn't work. The nut job who just shot up the synagogue. He may have had a lot of online friends. He may have had a lot of, this been part of these online communities, but he lived alone. He lived a friendless life. He was isolated. These are two guys. Now, they could have done a lot of damage. One of them did a considerable amount of damage. And this is, not something to underplay. But this is not representative of the great and good 320-some million people in America, in the United States of America. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. In fact, when this happened in Pittsburgh, everybody, left, right, and center, looked at this synagogue and this suffering community and said, how can we help? Right? The Muslim communities in the Pittsburgh area started raising money to help the victims. Most Americans, are good, decent people, and they're on both sides of the aisle. Just as you couldn't say, oh, Timothy McVeigh represents people in the military. I've had a lot of people, we like to point to the Alexandria baseball shooter to represent that it's not merely, violence is not merely a right-wing phenomenon. But you know what? The world has millions of people who voted for Bernie Sanders, who are totally on board with those wacky socialist ideas that we don't hold in very high regard. But they're not bad people. I mean, their ideas are bad, but they're not horrible human beings. They are not hateful. They are not looking to hurt people. And they're not about to take a machete and hack up their neighbors. Bill Nelson is really doing I understand he's just trying to, let's not be hateful, let's not be fearful, let's not be jealous, all that kind of stuff. But he really is painting the country as on the verge of this giant, terrible, violent brother against brother slaughter, and we're not. Now, I don't know whether it's just that these things are happening 2 weeks before midterm election. It's like all the incentives are on. The opposition party is the embodiment of all evil, and you have to get out there and vote and stop them. If you stay home and don't vote, your children will suffer. The earth will crash into the sun. Everything possibly wrong could go wrong. And our side are noble and good and brave and hardworking Americans and everything that's decent about them and stuff like that. And we can't possibly acknowledge that there are nut jobs on our side. We can't possibly acknowledge that there are bad people on our own side. Now, the interesting thing is this mentality of all or nothing, no enemies to my left or no enemies to my right. You might say, okay, well, this is going to happen during the heat of campaign season. Greg, I don't know about you, the heat of campaign season seems to get longer and longer each year.
Oh, we don't even have off seasons anymore. I mean, we're constantly already headed into whatever election season is next. As soon as Trump was elected, we started hearing about the blue wave. The day the midterms are over, we're going to start hearing about 2020, and it's just going to go on and on and on. And part of that is cable news. They got time to fill, and part of it's just the fact that everyone's looking for the next fight. The permanent campaign, I think, as I don't know if Bill Clinton coined the term or people coined it about him, constantly keeping everybody in the loop and turning every issue into a major debate. It's kind of where we've been for the last generation, and it's not going anywhere. It's probably only going to get more intense.
Can we just pick one day on the calendar, Greg, where we don't have to word our arguments for maximum partisan value? just one day where we can say, you know what, there's some idiots on our side. I say that all the time, but nobody likes me, Greg. Or should I say, a vocal segment of the political news audience does not like hear it. What do you be saying when I, acknowledge it? Hey, we got some nut jobs. There's some good people on the other side. Some nut jobs on our side.
I think we reserve that for a couple hours on election night, where everybody promises to work together, kind of like I mentioned yesterday, and then the very next day, it's put on the brass knuckles again, and we're back at it. So
I was going to say there is that one period, like 2 or 3 days after the election, where every candidate you've been hearing about how great they are, that ends up losing or falling short on election day, all of a sudden the party says, "Oh my God, they were terrible candidates." They couldn't organize a 2-car motorcade. This guy drooled on himself. What a bunch of blithering. We're lucky we got 45% in that race, man.
Yes, it's not the partisan sniping. It's where you take your own, like the lame horse into the back pasture and just end it. Fun times. Well, we'll be there in a week. Jim, talk to you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. And don't forget to visit our friends over at ZipRecruiter. Right now, 3 Martini Lunch listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/martini. And tune in again Wednesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.